and welcome back to another Greater Culture Chats. This is episode 3 of our nutrition series. So far, we've covered why nutrition is important. And then last week, we started to talk about when do we know it's time to potentially make some changes. So today, we're going to be taking CrossFit's 100 words of fitness and talk a little bit about how much should we eat. And so we thought it'd be a nice place to kick things off with the first sentence of World Class Fitness in 100 Words. And it says, eat meat and vegetables, nuts and seeds, some fruit, little starch, and no sugar. But this next sentence is where we're really going to be keying in for today's conversation, which says, keep intake to levels that will support exercise, but not body fat. And I think when people start to think about nutrition, a lot of times they think about, well, I want to eat in a way that maybe helps with some of those aesthetic goals, performance goals, those things we talked about in our last episode. But how much is that actually should we be eating? And how do we go about figuring that out? I think it's a great place for us to start of how much should we actually be eating? And so, Chelsea, when you get a chance to work with clients or talk to them in the gym, where does that conversation usually start for you?
Well, that's the big thing. We've been doing fitness for a while. We're not seeing results. Now we need to step into that nutrition realm, and we have to break down like, well, what are we eating? And a lot of times we don't even know. It's almost like this mindless, like fueling your body when you're hungry, even when you're not hungry, when you're bored, things like that, or just when it's in front of you. And so you don't even know what you're consuming. And so how are you supposed to know if that's enough for what you're doing or if it's going to lead to that body fat? So that, that first hurdle that we cross when we have our first sessions is just recording what we are consuming. Because a lot of times we're consuming way more than we need to.
It is really fascinating when you look at some of the research around that of how much we underestimate what we're eating. And I think it's one of those when you ask somebody, hey, how's your nutrition? The sort of stock answer is it's pretty good. And maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But when we actually get a chance to look in the mirror and write down or keep track of what we're actually consuming, it surprises most folks when they add everything up and they're like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that this little extra serving of this or an extra bite of this
Mm-hmm.
adds to some of those calories. And I think what I like about this, this sentence in the Fitness in 100 Words is we do need to eat because eating is fuel and energy to help us do all the things we want to do, whether that's get through our day of work, whether that's exercise, whether that's do fun physical activities outside of work and outside of the gym, whether it's keeping up with our kids. All of these things require energy and require fuel,
Mm-hmm.
which means we certainly have to eat to support that. We can't just go to the complete opposite end of the spectrum and say, well, I'm just not going to eat at all so I can lose body weight or, drop a few pounds. Like, no, we need to eat to support that, but we got to figure out and dial in what's the right amount that helps us support all the fun stuff we want to do and helps our health and all those great things that we want to keep in check, like our body composition and things like that. And so I think tracking is such a
Mm-hmm.
great tool to use. And we encourage folks at the end of our last episode to just start to notice and take notes, keep track of all the things you eat, all the things you drink. And that gives us a nice baseline of just, hey, where we're starting. Well, if we have that baseline, how do we start to determine how much I should eat? Because you hear people talk about like sort of the simple calories in, calories out that dictates our body weight and where we're at.
Mm-hmm.
So, what does that conversation look like when you're starting to talk to somebody about how much we should eat then?
Yeah, so the calories in, calories out, right? Calories out is a difficult number to find unless you are in a lab doing like everything within a bubble and someone's measuring your levels the whole time. It's really difficult to know calories out, even though we have these watches that say, hey, you burned this many calories, so on and so forth. It's good to have those numbers, they are encouraging, but really we want to focus on the calories in because that's what we know hard and fast and we can have more control over. So for the calories in, there are, general ranges we want to stay in. If we sat down for a session, we would definitely nail down the specific number based on your age, height, body weight and your goals and all that kind of stuff. But a range for men is typically 2,200 calories to 3,200 calories in a day, not to go below 1,500. And then for women, it's going to be 1,600 calories to 2,400 calories, not to go below 1,200 calories. We've got different numbers there based on what our bodies are doing on the inside and things like that as well. So that's a good range to start at. But, if we were talking before this about what our baseline calories are, and looking at that number sometimes is like, whoa, am I supposed to eat that much? Or like, that does not seem like enough either.
And what's fascinating too is when we look at all how our calories are used throughout the day, a great majority of them are actually used for just normal daily functions, just
Yeah.
like being able to breathe, keeping your heart beating, getting some energy for your brain so you can think and process. And most of us think, oh, I'm eating so I can go work out for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an
Mm-hmm.
hour. But when we look at how much energy it takes to do that, it's actually a very small amount compared to the rest of our day,
Mm-hmm.
which also sometimes gets us into trouble when we're like, ooh, I worked out really hard for 45 minutes or an hour. I can go eat whatever I want or do whatever I want. And I
Mm-hmm.
think sometimes we see some of the professional athletes doing that. And you're like, well, look, this person, they work out, I work out, they're eating whatever they want. It's like, it's a little different, a little different. But there's so many factors that can influence that range because, like you said, for even men, like that's a 1,000 calorie range, which can
Mm-hmm.
feel like a lot. So having a starting point of, how active are you with life outside of working out in your job? When you start looking at how often you're working out and what type of training you're doing, all these things play a factor. But it's nice just to have a general
Mm-hmm.
sense of, hey, if I can get in this many calories, and then I start to take notes of, measuring things like how are my clothes fitting? How's my energy level? Am I sleeping well? Am I getting through my workouts? Those types of things are going to help give us some of those indicators other than just the scale on, am I eating enough to make sure that I'm hitting the exercise that I'm doing and the lifestyle I want to live
Mm-hmm.
without adding that body fat. I think for some folks, it's nice to tune into some of those factors outside of just stepping on the scale,
Mm-hmm.
consistently. Is that what you've
Yeah.
seen too?
Yeah, it's always like the change of seasons when you have to put your jeans back on, and when you get them on that first try, it's kind of a nice feeling. Or in the summer when the shorts go on for the first time, you're like, "Oh, wow, these are a little loose. That's kind of nice." Or you put them on and you're like, "These fit a little tighter than I would like." That is my signal that I need to get it back in check, you know?
Hmm. Yeah. And one of the things too that I think is important to understand is that we're looking at trends and we're looking at consistency over time
Hmm.
because we might eat in a way that supports the lifestyle we have or keep our calories relatively similar. But then all of a sudden, we've got summer vacations coming up. You go on a trip, you go for the weekend, and maybe you have opportunities to enjoy and take in a little bit more food or a little bit more drink. And what can happen is, well, you're like, well, I ate really well for these 3 or 4 days, but then these other 3 or 4 days, maybe it was a little bit more challenging to keep our calories in check. And over time, those trends, they really add up.
Hmm.
So we're
Yeah.
looking at the consistency over time, not just can I do it for one day or 2 days, but generally these things sort of even out over time. That's
Hmm.
typically what we see with the calorie consumption.
Yeah, you don't lose weight in a day because you didn't gain it in a day either. So yeah, it is kind of annoying that you have to put so much work into it.
It's one
But
of the
yeah,
biggest reasons why we call it a lifestyle.
yeah, exactly, exactly. But yeah, having that range is super helpful. And if you're looking at this like, I have no idea where to start, right? Start, just start in the middle of the range. See where your numbers line up to that if you've been recording those numbers, and check in with what you're looking at. And now, if you are eating more than your range, right? How do you pull back? Because that can be tough to pull it back. And a good thing that you can do is, maybe you're someone who's just, it's been ingrained in you, you have to finish your plate, right? I know that's a tough one for a lot of us, us millennial babies. Like, we got to finish that plate or we can't get up. And it's a tough one to get past. So maybe, little tip or tricks that you might have, or one of them I have, is just grab a smaller plate to begin with. so you don't put as much on it and things like that. And what have you experienced with that? If you had to pull your calories back, what are some tips and tricks that you would have for that?
Yeah, it's funny because when I think about pulling calories back, it's the sneaky calories sometimes that get you. Like, if you're cooking things using oil or butter, those are calories essentially that are included in how much you're eating. Sometimes we don't even consider that to be like, oh, I just threw a little bit of something in the pan to heat it
Hmm.
up. I'm not counting that. Or condiments as well. I'm somebody who, if I love different sauces and marinades and things like that. But taking a peek at some of those different sauces and marinades and realizing, like, oh, wow, like, a couple tablespoons of this is 150 to 200
Hmm.
calories. So, yes, it tastes delicious, but that's a lot of calories compared to maybe some other options. And then it's usually like the snacking as well for me, where it's like, if I'm feeling hungry or I'm like bored watching TV, it's really easy to go for a snack or just munch on chips. For me, like chips and salsa is like the go-to. But all of a sudden you're like, wow, I just ate like half a bag of chips while I
Yeah,
was
that
watching
wasn't
the show.
that
It
wasn't
wasn't
good.
intended. So for me, those are some of those like little sneaky areas of what we're using to cook, some of the condiments we might be using, or even just like what we're doing for some of our snacks. And it can be as simple as trading some of those out for some different options, or sort of setting aside or figuring out, hey, this is how much I'm going to eat, rather than like just
Hmm.
pulling out the big bag and going in. Like, sit, like you said, pull out a smaller bowl, fill it up, and this is what I'm going to eat for my snack or whatever else, and then use that. So I think those are just some small ways that we can identify that. And then the last one I would say is our beverages too.
Yeah.
Depending on what we like to drink, there can be a lot of calories in certain things. Like I love coffee, love a good latte, but when you start looking at the caloric intake of a latte or some of those different coffee drinks we might like, it'll
Hmm.
surprise you how much is in there. And it doesn't really
Yeah.
make you feel full when you're done, but your body still is processing those calories, that energy.
Yeah. And that's, and we're not saying you have to get rid of all of these things. Just take a look at it, you know?
Mhm.
If you still want that, latte with the syrups and the fancy milks and all that, maybe we cut something else out later in the day so that we can still have those fun drinks. So it's just little things like that that can help move it, move the needle down, I guess is the way you want it to go.
Yeah. And if you were to work with one of us as a coach, we would sit down and we would establish that caloric intake to help hit your goals. And then there's an ongoing experiment, if you will, of
Hmm.
figuring out and testing out, are we moving in the direction we'd like? Are we hitting the number of calories we'd like? And we'll dive into in future episodes what we want those calories to be comprised of, because there's a lot of different ways we can get those calories in the body. And what we tend to find is that there are certain ways we can eat or certain things we can eat that can make us feel really full or make us feel like we're
Hmm.
eating a ton of food. And it's the same caloric intake as another item, which maybe leaves us feeling like we still are hungry or we want some more. So we're excited to dive into some of those. But we thought it would be nice just to share from a general standpoint how much we should be eating. There's some ranges we have, but there's also some goals attached to that of just being able to live an active lifestyle, eat enough to support that, but not eat so much that we add the body fat in.
Yeah. And if you're playing along at home and you want to keep up with the journey of the nutrition talks, right? So last week you were writing down what you were eating. This week, let's write down the actual like calories that went with it. Okay. So we're looking at our total caloric intake for the whole day, and trying to figure out what that number looks like and holding on to that for next week so we can talk about how to fill that number a little bit better in the future.
Yep. Love that. So if you're someone who loves paper and pen, perhaps use that. Take a peek at some of those labels as you're eating. If you are somebody who likes apps and things like that, maybe download MyFitnessPal or something like that and just add some of those foods in just to kind of see what you're at and how many calories you're typically taking in. But we look forward to catching up with you next week, where we're going to start to dive into this concept known as macronutrients, which is just what are the foods we're eating and how are they going to either help us move
Hmm.
towards the goals we'd like, or maybe they move us away from some of those. So, from episode 3 on what or how much we should eat, This is Brad and Chelsea. Thanks, y'all, for listening. We look forward to seeing you all next week.
Bye.